Welcome everyone to our data-driven meetup. And this is our 5th session that we have done and recorded, might be our 6th. But we're really excited to go over a really important topic on data lakes and data pipelines. I'll quickly go through our agenda for today. We'll first kind of discuss the meeting format, upcoming events for our data-driven meetup. We'll introduce our speakers today, and then our presentation will be on data lakes and data pipelines. And like every session we have, we'll end with Q&A, panel discussion. So we want to encourage everyone to be to answer or to ask any questions that you have. We'll make it interactive, and I want to make sure we get to every question. So yeah, meeting format today, just a reminder that this is a virtual meeting, so please observe customary Zoom webinar etiquette. We certainly encourage you to participate in the chat window, so make any comments, send any questions for the speaker in that chat window. We will, of course, be holding a Q&A session after the presentation, and then a link of the recording for today's webinar and any content will be sent out via email. We'll also send out a short follow-up survey via email to help us improve our event. So if you get that survey, please take just a minute, fill it out. We want to get better at these data-driven meetup sessions, and we love your feedback. All right, so let's talk about some upcoming events. So we hold these data-driven meetups once a month. So our next session will be on the 13th of September at noon Central Time. This will be a great session. This will be 10 tips and tricks for polishing your Tableau dashboards. So we'll go over the best practices that you can follow for building a really well-designed Tableau dashboard in that 45-minute presentation, right? Subsequent to that, we have some more events coming up for the DDC. That'll be October 11th, November 8th, and December 13th. So lots of sessions that are coming each month. I hope you can join these in the future. All right, just a reminder too that Salesforce, they every year have a gigantic conference they call Dreamforce. If you haven't heard of it, there's still time to sign up. That'll take place September 12th to the 14th, and we've included the link down below if you want to register. Tableau has obviously a big footprint at Dreamforce, so just a reminder that that is still accessible, and you can still grab a ticket for that. All right, so I will turn it to Chris, our featured speaker today. He's going to be talking about data lakes and data pipelines. Chris, over to you.
All right, thanks, Stuart. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Great to see a lot of familiar faces. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Monahan, president of XeoMatrix. We're a Tableau Gold partner based here in Austin, Texas. And I have about 20 years in data analytics, data warehousing. And today I'm going to be talking to you about data lakes and data pipelines. Stuart's also going to who's also our director of sales and client success. He sees a lot of questions around this from clients as well. So between the two of us, we'll try to demystify a lot of what is a data lake and what is a data pipeline. So probably one of the most popular questions we get from our Tableau clients is, what's a good data strategy for us? We hear about these data lakes and data pipelines. We have all these disparate data sources. How do we connect all this stuff together? And how do we even get started with something like a data stack, right? So what we decided today was to put together a presentation that, again, sort of demystifies all of that and simplifies it down into terms that that really lays out what is a data lake, what's a data pipeline, why is that beneficial to you and your organization, how do you go about even evaluating a tech stack? There's just so many vendors out there today, and then what are the recommendations for making a wise purchase, right? And then, like Stuart said, we'll open it up to a Q&A session. So let's start off with a quick overview. So as I mentioned, probably the most popular question we get from Tableau clients and all of our clients is that, we have so much data. Data is everywhere today. It's plentiful. Everything you have and own creates data. Your phone creates data. your TVs create data. Everything creates data nowadays. And when it comes to your business, you most likely have many data sources that you use, your business and different departments use every day to make very important decisions. One of the challenges with that, especially now that everything is moved to the cloud, is that now you have some stuff that are on-prem internally, you have stuff that's in the cloud, all these different data sources that you need to consolidate, and it's just hard to do. So how do you get a unified view of your business? Well, that's where data lakes and data pipelines come in, right? So what is a data lake? You guys might have heard this. It's simply just a centralized repository where you can store large volumes of raw data. So you're storing your data, you can process it there and keep it secure. Now, the key there is that it's raw data. You're not transforming it in any way according to certain business rules. You are essentially parking your data as is and archiving it historically, right? And keeping it there for later use, maybe for a rainy day. You're not really quite sure what you're going to do with it, but you have it. And so that data can be, as I mentioned, very structured, right? It could be some database tables or something from Excel, as small as that, or it could be like semi-structured, like XML files, or it could be unstructured data, like image files or audio files or like tweets or something from social media, right? So all those types of different data sources and structures are supported by a data lake. Now, if you heard of data lakes, you probably also heard of some other terms like a data warehouse. Even the term nowadays is starting to become popular as a lake house. And the question was like, what's the difference between all these? Like, why would I want to use one versus the other? What's the different approaches? What are they? If you think of it like this, your data lakes, again, support different types of structured data, structured, semi-structured, unstructured data. And a data lake is going to be more flexible in nature, right? So you can have both relational and non-relational data in your data lake. When it comes to a data warehouse, that data is going to be more curated, right? It's going to be structured by some business rules that are usually, that come from talking to the business and the reporting and analytic needs that you have. So you're cleansing this data and structuring the data for analytics and reporting, which is great. But the challenge with that, it takes a lot of maintenance. There's a cost associated with that. And when you're transforming that data, sometimes that can lead to quality control challenges. It's a little less flexible and agile. So what's become popular nowadays are these data lake houses, right? They're sort of the best of both worlds. And so it doesn't, the idea is you're still parking your data, but you can add some sort of structured reporting layer on top of that, where it doesn't require you to duplicate all that data again into a separate database. So that gives you that agility and the flexibility to find that data on the fly, and gives you really two methods of exploring the data. On the maybe data lake side of the house, you can go ahead and have your data scientists explore the data there, and then your BI team can still use more the structured approach. So it's really the best of both worlds, and that's sort of what that term's becoming a lot more popular. When it comes to data pipelines, think of it as just a mechanism or method to collect data from all these different data sources and then move them from all these data sources into your data lake or data warehouse or lake house, whatever you want to call it. It's the method of moving it, right? It's going to store that data centrally in a location. Now, that data can be transformed as well, right? So the transformations, it'll transform that data from raw data into a data that's available and ready to use either for analytics or applications, or even machine learning and AI. So the thing about data pipelines is that there's a lot of different supported connectors and different types of pipelines out there. Some are vendor supported, which we'll talk about here later in the presentation, but some can also be custom scripted via maybe using an API method or something like that. So these data pipelines are important because that's the mechanism you're going to use to move your data and then centralize it all in your data lakehouse. So what are the benefits of this, and why do you really why should you care about doing this, right? So as I mentioned, with our Tableau clients, we hear this a lot, like we have all these different data sources. How do we pull this together? Currently, we need to blend our data. And as you know, blending data in Tableau is great. It's flexible, it's quick to do, but it has its own limitations too, right? In terms of how much data you can usually blend together in Tableau Desktop or Prep, and also there's a performance impact sometimes with that as well. So anytime you have the opportunity to centralize your data in a single place, that's always a good idea to do, and that's where the data lake or data lake house comes into play, right? So you would create a pipeline, and the benefit is that you're going to have now all your raw data in one place, and also that's going to give you give you more agility, because now rather than maybe as you all know, when you're starting a project, there's a lot of requirements up front. You're trying to determine what data you need and things like that. You are collecting all the data now, and you are sourcing that data, and then you can go ahead and explore it later as you start building out your reporting layer versus spending all the time up front in the build process of your data lake. So that gives you a lot more flexibility, and it's going to be a lot less maintenance too, than maybe a traditional data warehouse. That gives you quicker time to insights. As I mentioned, you won't have to do the blending in Tableau or in your reporting layer, and you're just going to be able to build your dashboards faster, because now you don't struggle with some of those joins that maybe always cause you problems, right? So there's that. All these are the benefits that you'll see by sort of having this combination of data lakes and data pipelines. Now, here's a diagram just to sort of give you a visual representation of what, when we talk about these things, data lakes and data pipelines, what is that, right? So this is a example architecture. Across the top, we sort of have left to right our data sources. And then we have our a data load process, and then we're storing the data, and then we're consuming it in the reporting layer in Tableau. So with our data sources, those data sources, as I mentioned, can be anything from on-prem internal data sources that you have. Maybe it's an Oracle system or Teradata or some other place you're pulling data from. It could be in the cloud, right? So it could be a great example that we see is Salesforce. That's a perfect example to pull in. Or it could be flat files. They could be some sort of data extract or something that you're provided maybe from a third-party vendor through a SFTP site. All these sort of data sources need to be consolidated, and you would pull those in using data pipelines. And those pipelines, as I mentioned, could be custom scripts, or they could be these vendor tools, which we'll touch on later. And these connectors are used to go ahead and ingest the data into your database, which is there in the middle. And that's going to be preferably in the cloud, right? That's really the movement where a lot of places are going. There's a lot of great cloud platforms out there, Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, things like that. And people are moving their data there. So you'll move your data into your data lake, and then still maintain that sort of reporting layer for production use and consumption with with Tableau. So that's sort of what example architecture looks like. Stuart, I don't know if you have any other comments.
Yeah, when I look at this diagram, I see like API connections. We've had a lot of clients in the past that have the more common applications. They might use NetSuite or QuickBooks and Salesforce, and all those sort of applications exist in the third-party pipeline tools. But there, every now and then, is an application that just it's trickier to connect to, but they offer an API, and that's a good representation here, Chris, where we've had many situations where we'll build with that API documentation, we can build a connector that can flow into the data lake. So that's a common request that we see, for some of the more unique data sources out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think, going back and talking about Salesforce, there's a lot of connectors that are supported out of the box with Tableau. And I know, especially when people are just getting started, they tend to connect to those. But once they start connecting 2 or 3 of those and blending them together, they do see sometimes that it's going to scale a lot better and be more performant if they do consolidate that data. So even something as common as Salesforce, which, has a very good connector into Tableau, you're going to get it's going to be easier to consume that data if you go ahead and put it into like a data lake or some central repository. Yep. So yeah, so I guess, we've sort of laid out sort of what is a data lake and a data pipeline, and what's the benefits of doing this. I think now it comes down to sort of what is the how do you go about selecting a tech stack. And tech stacks, there's just so many vendors out there. There's many options, and here's just a few. There's probably a good probably 100 more, but one common trend among them all is a lot of them are in the cloud. Some support both on-prem and the cloud. So there's a lot of things that when you're evaluating and trying to pick your tech stack that you want to consider in order to make a good purchasing decision. And so one of the things we wanted to put together is, when you're looking at a data lake or a database, for that matter, platform and a data pipeline, what are some of the most common things we hear during the evaluation process? So I think with any sort of database, it's important to talk about the hosting, right? Are you going to host that on-prem within sort of your corporate network? Or is this going to be cloud-based, right? There is a huge trend to go to the cloud, but there are some business use cases and justifications why people like keeping that in-house. So that's something you definitely want to consider, especially when it comes to cloud data, data lakes. You want to understand the cost. So one is, what does that pricing structure look like, and how much is that? How much is it going to cost to maintain from a resource standpoint? To maintain the system and the platform. When it comes to the pricing structure, a lot of the pricing structures are more geared nowadays toward compute and storage, and then some other variables. So some of them are real heavy on compute, and that's where it can really cost you. But under certain circumstances, that compute cost might be worth it because it's easier to use. So for example, we have some folks that use a certain platform, and it is based off of compute, but their jobs only run frequently in the morning. They're not doing real time during the day. So the flexibility of having a easy to use platform that they can train their resources on quickly and bring them up to speed is worth the some of the pricing costs around compute. And vice versa, we have some other ones that are maybe a little bit more challenging to use, but the pricing model is a little more flexible. So all those are types of things that you need to evaluate when it comes down to costs. You obviously want to understand is the performance and scalability going to meet your SLAs? And we'll talk about that here in a few slides, but you want to trial it and understand, is this going to scale for your organization? How much data do you think you're going to store, and will this support it? Does it meet your security standards? That's very important as well. There's a lot of HIPAA out there, a lot of compliance standards that people need to meet, and you need to understand the nuances between them and make sure that they're encrypting at rest, how they store their data, and make sure that it meets your corporate standards. And then lastly, I touched on the ease of use. That's very important, because most likely you're moving to a new platform and you don't have these skill sets in-house, and you're going to have to train your resources. So how do you go about doing that? And is it something that they can pick up quickly, or is it going to take the better part of 6 months to a year to get proficient in it? So these are the things that we commonly hear and tell people to look for when they're doing evaluating a new sort of data lake environment or platform. Stuart, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's a great summary. Maybe something on this slide, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I think from so from a data pipeline side, right? Very similar types of things. Obviously, you want to understand performance and scalability, ease of use, but on the pipeline side of things, there's the connectors are really important. Obviously, as we mentioned, a lot of these vendors out there today support various connectors. And so when you're evaluating a vendor, you want to understand how many connectors do they support and what types of connectors do they support. Most importantly, you want to make sure that they support all the ones that you have in your use case, right? We do sometimes see that people use a combination of two vendors. That's an okay option as well. But when you evaluate a vendor, you want to make sure not only do they have it on the list, but how well do they support that connector? Some are better at it than others. You'll find that some are community supported, right? and some are supported directly by the vendor. So it's very important to dig into the details of how long the connector's been around, how well has it performed, and then what's the likelihood of it getting updated, right? Also, do you support custom connectors? As Stuart mentioned, there's a lot of different applications that we connect to. Of course, out of the box ones that most vendors support are going to be your NetSuites, your Salesforces, but you're going to get more obscure ones that maybe aren't supported directly, and they require an API to connect to. So like Toast, for example, is very popular in the restaurant industry, but there's not as many vendors supporting that. So sometimes we have to write a connector for that. And you want to make sure that that platform can support these custom connectors. And then when it comes to support itself from the vendor, you want to make sure that they have good technical support, and you want to understand their SLAs, because nothing's worse than running an ETL load or a data load, on a Monday morning or a Sunday, or even on the weekend, and having it fail and having no one to reach out to, right? So you need to understand these SLAs, because this is your data. You have to support your business, and you need to understand what the turnaround time is going to be. And then lastly, I would say when it comes to a lot of these data pipeline platforms, cost varies between them. So some are, the pricing structure is based on compute. So you spin up an instance, and as long as that instance is running, then that's the price you pay. That works great for maybe certain scenarios where you're processing a lot of records and you feel like you can do it quickly. In other cases, you might want to go based on the number of records, and sometimes that differs. That could be total records that are being updated, or it could be sort of like the difference in records, right? It could be the differential in updates on a daily basis, right? So it just varies from vendor to vendor, but you want to understand the nuances there, because it can quickly scale or get out of hand on pricing if you don't understand the nuances between that, have to refresh like your entire NetSuite environment. So that's something very, very important that you want to understand when you're making your evaluation. All right. So putting this all together, when you're making your purchasing recommendations, we tell people that, follow sort of these basic steps. You want to go ahead and first identify all your data sources for current and future use cases, right? Understand make a list of just all of them that you currently need, your NetSuites, your Salesforces, and then any future ones that you feel you might need. And that'll help you to, again, look at the vendor's connector portfolio to see what they support. Then list all the requirements that are both important to you and also the business, the IT and the business. So you want to understand what are the SLAs, what are the refresh times that they need, how the refresh frequency that they need, and all that will start to factor into the costs. So gather all that information. And then select 2 to 3 vendors and perform a trial. Now, this is important because they all the vendors allow you to do some sort of trial. And again, because some of them are based on compute, or with the data pipelines are also based on the volume of data you're moving, right? It's important to do this trial, because during this trial period, typically it's free to load that data. And that way you can start to see a pattern and understand what your daily volume is going to look like. And you can then start to estimate your costs. So I highly recommend a trial. That's going to be the best way for you to understand your future costs. And then you can budget for that for the year. Another thing too, is that you can pre-purchase credits. So when it comes to compute, you can pre-purchase credits, and that way that'll give you a little bit of a discount up front on any of that cost. And so that's another great way to just understand what does that discount model look like when you're talking to a vendor. The pricing structure and the maintenance costs is all that you need to factor in. And the maintenance, of course, also being your resources. How long, how much support and how many resources do you think are going to be needed for this new platform? We do find that with the data pipelines, they're very efficient, and especially for some of our smaller organizations that we work with, it saves them a lot of time and really, pretty much a full resource. In the past, back in the old days, probably dating myself, you used to have a whole team that supported a lot of these data pipelines, and now it's simple point and click, and it's a fractional part of someone's job. So it's a huge savings to go ahead and move, obviously, to this type of model. So that's why we highly recommend it. During your purchasing process, create a project plan, understand what the rollout and timeline is going to look like, right? And then, of course, purchase training and certifications for your team, and then go ahead and deploy. And everything should run pretty smoothly. So, that's really sort of high level what considerations to make when you're making your purchase. And following these steps, we've seen a lot of successful rollouts of data lakes and data pipelines. So with that,
Chris,
go ahead.
One thought too on the previous slide, like we have a lot of clients that, they have lots of data sources, and they do these data lake projects work really well in a phased approach as well. Like you don't have to do, a lot of our clients will isolate the key data sources that they want to, generate, key reports off of, and they, kind of in a phase 2 or 3 will bring in the whole list of data. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done all at once. Would you agree, Chris?
Yeah, no, I definitely would agree with that. That's a fair statement for sure. Cool. So with that, I will say that, if you have any questions about this, or just where to get started just in this process, or even want some guidance or recommendations on maybe some different platforms we've seen, feel free to reach out to myself or Stuart. Be happy to set up a quick call and just chat with you. And so let me go ahead and Stuart, let's open it up to some Q&A here.
Yeah, we had a few questions that came in. So one was asked, so what about data out of Tableau to your systems so that another entity can access data? So what about data out of Tableau to your system so that another entity can access it? Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that that's something that we typically do a lot of. I'm trying to think of an instance where we've done that. One approach might be is to, you could use, if it depends how this data source is being created. I mean, obviously, if this data source is something that you've created using Tableau Prep, right, and publishing this data source, you can configure that prep flow to maybe push that data into a table or somewhere else that could be consumed, right? You could also use the APIs to retrieve that data. Tableau has a very robust API. You can use Python or something to go ahead and retrieve the result sets from this data source and put it on a refresh. So that would sort of be the approach I would try there.
Yeah. And then someone asked about, they're only familiar with using Azure and SQL Server and Power BI. A little bit of experience there, but any thoughts on how that might translate to other tools out there? My thought on that question is that, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but a lot of the data lake technology, the vendors that are out there, it's relational based. So SQL works very well. Having that experience would translate well to other tools outside of Microsoft Azure.
Yeah. I think, if you're mainly on a Microsoft stack, I think, what I've seen, especially with some other platforms like Snowflake, for example, it's very easy to use, and we've seen a lot of people easily move from a SQL Server background into using Snowflake. So that transition was really easy for them, right? So I think, these tools are, great as well. Obviously, we're pretty partial to Tableau, but I think if you're on a stack like that, making a transition to some of the other vendors that we've mentioned here, there's a lot of commonality between the two, and we've seen people do that jump pretty easy. Yeah.
And one question we get a lot is, how long does it take to get a data lake set up and to get data in there? Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah. We it's sort of, like all things in life, it depends, right? I think the most things that that factor into it is how many different connections are you going to have? How many different data sources are you pulling together? And the reason being is, one, there's the level of effort to create the pipelines. Are any of them custom? That factors into it as well. And then how do you blend those data sources together on the database side? So that's something we didn't touch on here because it's a little more technical. But if you think of your different systems, let's just take two, NetSuite, Salesforce. One needs to be sort of the system of record, and you need to have you might have a master product hierarchy, or even a customer hierarchy, or even your employee hierarchy. And so that needs to be standardized, and those IDs from one system needs to be also stored in the other, or some sort of mapping table. So there's some work involved in that as well. I think, we do some engagements here that are as quick as like a week and a half, and that's more for like smaller departmental, even some larger companies that only have a couple data sources, right?
Yeah.
And it just really depends on the level of reporting that they need. But again, like a larger project, of course, could take several months for a first phase. So it just really sort of varies on the number of connectors. I don't know, Stuart, if
Yeah.
you see a lot more on the sales side, a lot of requests around. Like what are some of the factors you see that variable is there?
Yeah, I think you definitely hit on a few. It's the third party data pipeline platforms that are out there have made it so simple, so quick to load data. So that is awesome. Where that those products exist and it's really quick to get data in. We see when clients do have these custom applications that we have, you have to write some code to get the data in. That can take a little longer, but it's generally I've seen very fast to get data lake stood up. Now the warehousing part of it, to get it more curated and more organized for reporting, can take, that's sort of a work in progress and can take more time, but generally very fast.
Yeah, I would say from a development standpoint, like some of the shorter ones that we've done, which are just a few weeks, I would say a couple weeks even in actual level of effort. By the time you sort of trial and select a platform, like we have our own recommendations, but sometimes people want to try different ones as well. By the time you go through that vendor selection process, think of and trial it, it can be the better part of 3 to 4 weeks, and then a couple weeks in duration for development. So anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to get something going sometimes.
Another question that we get all the time is how do we know if we need to have a data lake?
Oh,
How do we need? I've got a few thoughts, but if you want to take it first, Chris.
yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I do know from a reporting standpoint, you'll start to hear your developers say that they can't, it's taking a long time to do the type of reports they want to build. The analytics that they want to do, the aggregations they want to do, maybe the data stored at different levels of aggregation, they don't join properly. They might be using Tableau Prep a lot. When you start hearing that stuff, they're doing too much heavy lifting on the data side, and it's time to consider consolidating your data. But even before that, I think if you hear a lot of your business just talking about all the different data sources that they have, you've probably outgrown just having these siloed systems, and it does make sense to have some sort of central data lake or lake house.
Yeah, and I would say too, like, a lot of times we'll have clients that they want to connect to data that Tableau just doesn't have a supported connector, right? And so that can be a big indicator. And they certainly want it to be automated. So taking exports can be taxing and frustrating to some degree. And that's usually a good indicator. Like, there are other data pipeline tools that might offer that connector and many more that a client has. And that's a good barometer to say, okay, well, we could set up a data lake, and have all of that data centrally located and optimized. So that's a big indicator that I see.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think something that maybe wasn't necessarily called out on these slides is, there's an automation to all this, and that's really what you're trying to do here. If you find that your teams are constantly doing data pulls and stuff like that, like there's a better way to do it, and go ahead and use these custom APIs or find a way to automate it, and that's going to be a huge savings.
Yeah. A question came in. Where do you see a formal enterprise data governance program fitting into the data lake and pipeline process? So what point in the setup process do you recommend data governance?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I would say, early on, obviously you want to keep data governance in mind. We always make sure that only certain people are stewards of the data, right? We don't want everybody creating these data pipelines and creating a bigger problem by putting everything into your data lakehouse. So you want to have a proper data governance strategy, early on, right out the gate, I think. Even if it's on a smaller departmental level, it doesn't have to be something super formal, but have the processes in place that who is allowed to pull in certain tables, right? Who's allowed to make those changes to your data pipelines and make those changes to the lakehouse, who has access to sensitive data, right? All that needs to happen up front. So I would do that very early on in the process. And just get that as part of your culture.
Yeah, another question came in, Chris. This organization has several third-party data sources. They want to harmonize them. They only have an on-prem SQL server, which is used as a warehouse. Do they need a data lake? That's the question.
Oh, so they only have one source, which is SQL Server.
It sounds like there are multiple third-party data sources, but it's they currently do have an on-prem SQL server. Presumably that data goes into.
Yeah, so we've had this scenario before, and we find that just with some of these pipeline tools that are out there, it's easier than using maybe your traditional tools like maybe a SSIS or something like that to pull it back into SQL Server. Try to modernize, and if the thought is moving more to the cloud anyway and moving off that SQL Server, then I would make the jump sooner than later. That would be my recommendation. So that's what we've done with a lot of clients, and certain platforms like Fivetran, for example, they have a SQL Server connector, and you can configure it to reach into your on-prem SQL Server and ingest that data into Fivetran and move it to like a Snowflake or somewhere. So we do that all the time. So that's a very common use case.
There was a clarification here that they have many sources that they buy, but only one of them goes into that SQL Server database. I would say yes to a data lake, right? And they said, for example, we buy data from Broadridge, SS&C, RIA database, but only the SS&C data goes to that warehouse. So data lake might be a great option to get all of that data centralized in one place for easier reporting. Yeah, I would say yes.
Yeah, I would too. Yep.
Yeah, good question. And someone else just asked, and this is probably it's a good question to come back up again, but just the difference between data lake, lakehouse, and data warehouse. Chris, do you want to maybe flip back to that slide one more time? Because this is certainly a good question and a topic that comes up a lot.
Yeah. So
we'll cover
this
that again.
we'll cover this slide one more time. So if you think of like a data lake being more like a parking lot where you're going to put more of your raw data, right? You're not really sure what you want to use it for. You park it there. And it can be explored later. That's you're not transforming it at this point, just parking it there. That's going to be your data lake. That data can be again in different formats, structured, unstructured, semi-structured, that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily modeled into a proper schema or anything like that. With a data warehouse, it's going to be more defined. So you're going to talk to the business, understand the KPIs they want, And then you would build out a proper schema or data model that supports these analytics that you want to run as a company. So you would build the dimensions and maintain all this, right? And ensure data quality as well. So, but that takes a lot of labor and a lot of time to build these data warehouses. So as I mentioned, there's something in between now where it gives you a little bit of both flexibility, where you can store that data now and then go ahead and build these reporting layers where you can go ahead and rather than reduplicating all your data into a data warehouse, you can do that right there in your data lake and lake house and report. And that way your data science team can explore the raw data, because they're trying to identify maybe certain nuggets out of that data. And then your analytics team that still needs those proper definitions for reporting purposes still have that as well. So that's sort of the differences there.
Yeah. All right. It looks like all the questions we had. Does anyone else have any last minute questions here? I think we got to them all.
All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, of course, we'd be happy to answer them. Just drop us an email, me or Stuart. We'd happy to answer an email or hop on a quick call. But thank you all for joining, and we will see you next month at our next DDC event. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.